Jeanette, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful, enlightening paper. We've all been reading your work since graduate school or before, and I learn something new every time. It's really, really remarkable. I love it. Our next speaker and the final speaker of the second session before we break for lunch is my dear friend Sofía Sanabrais, and she will be speaking on Asia, the Hispanic world, and the emergence of a new world through the lens of art. She is an independent scholar based in Los Angeles and former assistant curator of Latin American art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She has been the recipient of fellowships from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Mellon and Getty Foundations. She contributed a chapter on Asian art in the Hispanic world to the exhibition catalog for Art and Empire, the Golden Age of Spain, for the San Diego Museum of Art. Sofía, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the stage, to welcome you to San Diego Museum of Art, and to participate together after all of these years. Thank you so much. Welcome to the stage.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Roxana, to Graciela, to Bailey for doing so much this morning with our sound checks. For inviting me to San Diego, and especially to Michael Brown. You know, we go back more than 2 decades when we were just babies in graduate school, imagining what would happen eventually, you know, when we became adults. And there are so many people here today. I don't know if Jeanette realizes this, but when I was an undergrad, I think a freshman in college a long time ago, she actually, I took my first pre-Columbian survey with you, and I still have the reader to this day from that class. And Donna was a wonderful mentor to Neriam, Michael, and myself in graduate school, really introducing us to the museum world, you know, kind of taking us away from the art historical academic world and introducing us to what it takes to put together an exhibition when we got to see her put together Painting a New World. So much of my professional career when I was a curator, you know, was really indebted to Donna. So we'll be going back to the Jesuits again today. Okay, oh, yeah, I'm really short. Okay. Okay, so let's start. This is okay. Letters from Spanish and Portuguese Jesuit missionaries in China and Japan in the 16th century revealed the desire for Mexican amantecayotl, also known as feather paintings or feather mosaics, informing us that they were circulating throughout East Asia during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. A letter dated December 12, 1599, written in Macau and sent to Rome, requests that paintings be sent there and writes, quote, "If some of the images would come, shall they be made as the ones coming from New Spain, made of colored plumage, as they would be very appreciated." The history of pre-Hispanic and colonial Mexican feather painting, or arte plumario as it's known in the Spanish-speaking world, is well documented. In the year 1520 from Tenochtitlan, the capital of Mexico City, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés writes in his second letter to the Emperor Charles V in Spain that, quote, "The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma has every object in his dominions, fashioned in gold and silver and jewels and feathers, and those in feathers superior to the finest productions in wax or embroidery." Colonial Mexican codices like the Codex Mendoza documented feathers and objects fashioned out of feathers as tribute. A major international exhibition titled El Vuelo de las Imágenes, or Images Take Flight, Feather Art in Mexico and Europe, was mounted in Mexico City in 2011, and its scholarly catalog of the same name published in 2014. Perhaps the most well-known of the pre-Hispanic examples is the legendary and supposed headdress or penacho of Moctezuma II, who was the Aztec ruler at the time of the Spanish conquest, today housed in the Museum of Ethnology in Vienna. Here is its replica in the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City. Its resplendent long feathers from the quetzal bird, the bright blue feathers of the lovely cotinga, and the pink feathers of the flamingo set against gold has dazzled its admirers for centuries. The headdress has a long and complicated history, with recent scholarship questioning its provenance, and has been the subject of a decades, perhaps even centuries-long, intense diplomatic dispute regarding repatriation between Mexico and Austria. But that's the subject for a whole nother paper. Mexican featherworks are among the first objects from the New World commissioned and valued by the Spaniards as symbolic of Catholic triumphalism, since native feather artists, or amantecas, were using this indigenous technique to create religious works of art. The Spanish friar Pedro de Gante wrote that, quote, "With no prodding on our part, the amantecas make chasubles and capes and sleeves for crosses for religious processions, as well as mitres for bishops that could not be more beautiful or agreeable to the sight." And this, all of the details within these are all made of feathers, and this is at the Hispanic Society, right, Marcus? Extravagant liturgical garments like these were crafted in Mexico for members of the European clergy, and featherworks were often sent from Mexico to kings around the globe. We know that Mexican featherworks of religious subjects reached Japan, while others depicting secular subject matters like the Four Seasons were presented to Emperor Wanli, the 14th ruler of the Ming Dynasty in China. Mexican and Japanese artistic exchanges were not uncommon during the early modern period. The most significant example of artistic exchange between Mexico and Japan was the introduction of the Japanese byobu, or folding screen, into the Mexican artistic landscape. And if you haven't seen the byombo in the exhibition today, it's in the very last gallery, so save your stamina for that. The folding screen in Mexico, or byombo as it is known, it's a Portuguese and Spanish transliteration of the Japanese word byobu, provided new avenues for artists in a predominantly religious world to develop secular themes on a large scale. And these are just different examples that you can see. This one's in the catalog, mythological subjects, and a great, grand historical subject matter that we didn't really see on a large scale prior to the introduction of the folding screen. Today, this paper will briefly touch on a current research topic of mine, which explores the presence and reception of Mexican feathers in Japan, and question how the New World phenomenon of featherwork may have been reinterpreted there. The relationship between Japan and Mexico is rarely mentioned in early modern art historical literature. It is a subject studied primarily by historians of religion who examine the Christian century in Japan, and economists who investigate the global impact of the silver trade and the roles played by both Japan and New Spain. Mexican interest in Japan peaked during the late 16th and early 17th centuries when Mexican friars joined the missionary efforts in East Asia. The connection between Japan and Mexico was further intensified with the martyrdom of the Mexican Jesuit Felipe de Jesus, the first Mexican-born saint and member of the ill-fated group of 26 Christians martyred in Nagasaki in February 1597, depicted in a number of colonial paintings across Latin America and Spain. My previous examinations of the relationship between Mexico, Spain, and Japan through the lens of art, specifically the introduction of the Japanese folding screen into Mexico through both diplomatic and commercial means, and the Asian presence in colonial paintings, have highlighted how the Mexican engagement with the Asian world and Asian things was not a superficial relationship, but rather a deep-rooted presence in the colonial imagination. This engagement, while short-lived as a result of Japan's pseudo-policy of self-exclusionism from the mid-17th to the 19th century, demonstrated how cultural contact between seemingly disparate worlds and the global desire for objects across oceans transformed the material culture of the early modern world. The encounters between Japan and Mexico resulted in an artistic conversation fueled by mutual curiosity and the exchange of material culture in both the commercial and religious spheres. In his study of Japan and the Western world, The historian George Sansom considers the legacy of Spanish and Portuguese colonial enterprises on the peoples of East Asia. He maintains that while European culture barely affected the life and customs there before the 19th century, on the contrary, the impact of Asian material culture on Europe and its colonies was significant. He writes, "Even where Asiatic peoples were for long periods under European government, the essential nature of their civilization was little modified by their foreign rulers, who saw no profit in tampering with native customs and were inspired by no reforming zeal. Indeed, far from Europe affecting Asia, it was Asiatic goods that changed and enriched European life." The Habsburg rulers of Spain began collecting objects from Asia as early as the reign of the Emperor Charles V. Spain's colonization of the Philippines in 1564 and the subsequent establishment of the Manila galleon trade facilitated Philip II's access to a variety of Far Eastern goods. The galleon trade transformed Mexico City for centuries a center of trade and domestic goods into an international commercial center that specialized in Asian imports. And we saw a lot of these wonderful examples from Donna's talk. Asian goods such as silk, lacquer, porcelain, spices, and tea were sold in Mexico City's famous Parian or walled-in market. Exotic raw materials such as mother of pearl, ivory, and tortoiseshell, and objects like Japanese lacquer and folding screens aroused tremendous wonder. It should therefore come as no surprise that the vogue for Asian things and the copying and adapting of Asian forms, styles, and motifs in Mexican colonial art, like the biombo, native lacquer work from Pátzcuaro, and the renowned Talavera ceramics of the city of Puebla, predated by a century that of chinoiserie and Japanisme in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Mexican artists responded to the fascination with East Asian objects by producing local versions that could be less expensive and at times also better attuned to individual patrons' tastes. Further, the appreciation and consumption of Asian art by the Mexican elite and its incorporation into liturgical objects in Mexico reveals how certain objects were valued, as well as the naturalization of these pieces for religious use, a unique example visible in the incorporation of Edo period style panels into the pilgrimage church of San Miguel del Milagro in Tlaxcala, and in the use of Chinese porcelain on Mexican altars, especially in paintings depicting the holy image of the Cristo de Chalma. The high esteem in which those objects from the East were regarded in the Hispanic world was celebrated in an elaborate treatise on Philippine commerce and finances written in 1637. A Spanish governor wrote, "In Asia and the regions of the Orient, God created something so precious in the estimation of man and so peculiar to these provinces that, as they are only found or manufactured therein, they are desired and sought by the rest of the world." It is precisely this type of language for Asian goods that echoes the desire for Mexican featherwork in Asia. Until now, most of my research has focused on the influence of Asia in the Hispanic world vis-a-vis the colonial Mexican folding screen. And this is a recent acquisition at the Museo de America that had been in a private collection in Madrid, probably since the 17th century, which it's a subject I'm working on now that possibly depicts a group of Japanese ambassadors coming to Mexico for some celebrations. Today, I would like to look at a shift from Japan as influencer to Japan as receptor, to the possibility that Mexico influenced Japan, challenging Sansom's claim that there was only a unidirectional influence from East Asia outwards. To be sure, previous scholarship has constructed a discourse in which the colonial Latin American world is cast in the role of receptor of foreign influence, rather than a source of influence. So this comes to my current research, which is the interest in and interpretation of Mexican featherwork in Japan. The catalyst for this project was sparked by the accidental discovery of a Namban portable altar in the collection of the Tokyo National Museum that provides visual testimony to the contact and exchanges between Japan and Mexico in the early modern period. Unlike the majority of portable altars that include a small copper or panel painting in the central niche, I immediately recognized a Mexican feather painting, right here, depicting the martyrdom of St. Stephen, that to a Japanese colleague of mine was irrelevant in her study because she was really just looking at the actual lacquer altar and had sent me a number of images asking if any of them happened to have Franciscan or Jesuit iconography or symbols in them. And I was surprised when I saw this. In this image, it appears as if the feathers and colors have degraded somewhat, and it is hard to see the bright colors that remain. You can see the remnants of gold foil on the saint's body here, and the halo and these rays that emanate from the sky. Feather paintings are very fragile, and too much light exposure, temperature, and humidity fluctuations are detrimental to the organic nature of the materials. And here you can see just how different these two objects look. This one is in a private collection in Mexico City, and the owner, he actually has these in his dressing room covered with a velvet cloth so that they're constantly protected from any kind of light. On the other side of the conservation spectrum is a recent rediscovery in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum of a feather object that had been forgotten for over 60 years. This 17th century Mexican feather fan, which I was informed that Donna has written an article on, this entered the Peabody Essex collection in 1947 as a gift and was merely identified as fan. And it was placed into collection storage until it was rediscovered in 2004. Now you can imagine, I can't imagine being that person opening and discovering it, but I do know that after that, there were many collections that people were looking to their fans to open them. Japanese fans were among the most sought-after items among the women of the Spanish and Portuguese courts. And I think if you guys were looking closely at a number of the portraits that we've seen today, almost every woman has had a fan in her hand. In the early colonial period, Spanish missionaries oversaw the work of local feather artists known as amantecas, who created Christian images based on European prints. They can be seen here in the 16th century manuscript known as the Florentine Codex. And Jeanette Peterson and a team of scholars are actually doing this incredible project right now with the Getty to transcribe, translate, and work on the Florentine Codex. So you can see here the workers, with these images, cutting all of the feathers to get ready to put them in. You can see here this little saint. But you can really see the detail that the artists of the Florentine Codex captured in order to depict this very unique American tradition. The iridescent feathers from hummingbirds and other native birds that held special meaning for the Aztecs were carefully trimmed and applied in layers onto amate or maguey paper using orchid-based glues. And as a graduate student, I was lucky because there was this long international seminar and group of scholars who had gotten together, and one of the things one of the conservators did was she was creating the glue that they had used, and she told these incredible stories of concocting all of these formulas of orchid-based glues. So because of that, we know a lot more today about how these were done. And later, I can tell you how it is that I know that how we were able to identify all of these birds. It's a little too long to go into today, right now. The most famous school for amantecayotl, or featherworks, was overseen by the friar Pedro de Gante, a Franciscan missionary from Flanders, at the school of San José de los Naturales. Founded in 1527 on the site of Moctezuma's former aviary, San José de los Naturales was the first school set up to teach Christian doctrine to the native Mexicans by the Spaniards in Mexico City. The tradition of featherworking continued throughout the colonial period, especially in the region of Michoacán. The act of creating religious images out of feathers was in itself seen as part of the evangelical process, and for native artists, a spiritual act as well, since the materials held special meaning for them. For example, the hummingbird is the Aztec god of war, and I'm sure that there were other birds that held very specific meaning for these artists. Colonial featherworks were highly prized and were often sent to Europe as gifts. The most famous and earliest extant example of the colonial featherworking tradition is the Mass of St. Gregory. This feather painting was commissioned in Mexico City in 1539 as a gift of thanksgiving for Pope Paul III, whose papal bull recognized the humanity of the natives of America and condemned their inhumane treatment and enslavement. The uniqueness of these feather paintings, accentuated by the iridescence of the colored feathers and the meticulous method by which the feathers were applied, made these some of the most precious gifts of the New World and proved to the Spanish crown that the evangelization efforts and training of artists in the New World were successful. In 1569, when the Jesuits set out for Africa, among many of the gifts that were presented to the King of Mozambique was a feather painting depicting the Ecce Homo, a gift from King Philip II of Spain. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, the letters from Jesuit missionaries in China and Japan in the 16th century revealed this desire for Mexican feather paintings. In a letter sent by the Jesuit Manuel Diaz to Claudio Acquaviva in Rome, written in Macau in December 12, 1599, he requests that a retinue of painters bring with them to Macau an inventory of objects, among them, quote, good quality oil paintings of religious subjects. He specifically mentions, if some of the images would come, shall they be made as the ones coming from New Spain, made of colored plumage, as they would be very appreciated. In another letter dated November 8, 1585, the Archbishop of Évora writes, please send a picture of feathers that comes from the Indias de Castile, small or large, as in these parts they are of great esteem. And in a 1617 inventory of the Jesuit residence in Nanjing, 4 plumaria paintings of the 4 seasons are listed. This lacquer, altar, and feather painting combination is the only example of its kind in a Japanese collection and has rarely been published. An image of it was included in the Images Take Flight catalog of 2014, but there was no catalog entry written. Museum records note that it is unclear precisely what technique was used. So this is the Tokyo National Museum, that's what it says. But I'm planning a return trip to Japan to see this soon. The story of how these types of portable altars may have arrived in Japan is a long one, but to make a very long story short, in the first decade of the 17th century, there were a number of Japanese merchants that lived and worked in Mexico City who had arrived as a member of an entourage, and we know that they brought with them a number of objects to sell in the Parian, and they had remained there for about 3 years before they returned to Japan after they had sold all of their wares. In a recent essay, Karina Johnson writes about Aztec Regalia, noting that Hernan Cortez, whose second letter I quoted at the opening of this talk, sent Aztec objects back to Iberia and classified Mexican featherworks among the treasures of the New World. The elegant, sumptuous, and curious nature of the objects made them highly collectible among European rulers. Rudolph II of Prague was a known collector of Mexican featherwork. And among the objects in his collection is this remarkable example of St. Michael slaying the dragon, which was recently acquired by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I have recently begun a project with the German scholar of Japanese art, Anton Schweizer from Kyushu University, on the meaning, exchange, and use of feathers in Japan and Mexico, looking at garments like the Japanese jimbaori, and Catholic chasubles decorated with feathers like this one in the British Museum. Is there a link between these two traditions? We think so. The jimbaori emerged as an element of samurai costume in the late 16th century and was worn over a full suit of samurai armor. It was originally a purely functional garment intended to keep the wearer and the armor dry, but it developed into a symbol of personal taste and power, incorporating expensive and exotic, this is a different one, European and Chinese textiles and unusual materials like feathers in the fabrication and design. As the popularity and custom of wearing the jimbaori evolved, the designs became more elaborate. It has even been recorded that these ornate and luxurious jimbaori were worn into battle. In pre-Hispanic Mexico, the use of feathers on garments for rulers was commonplace, and at times they were truly ceremonial, and at times they functioned as markers of status, like the jimbaori. This is Nezahualcóyotl for the ruler of Texcoco from the Codex whatever. But he is garbed in a feather skirt, and he has a chimali, one of these feather shields. And it was an interesting meeting between myself and Dr. Schweizer, who just started talking about all of these similarities between a number of these garments. What I do know is that there was knowledge and interest in Japan for Mexican feathers. Japanese records reveal that in 1616, 2 Mexican ships departed Acapulco. Together they carried around 800,000 pesos of silver for the Manila treasury, and no trade goods to speak of. As they neared the Philippines, they were hit by a terrible storm and landed at 2 different ports in southwest Japan. Among the items that survived was a collection of Mexican feathers. In Tosa, the local daimyo wanted to buy a number of items from the Spaniards, but had no success. A letter from a samurai bargaining on behalf of the daimyo, dated September 29, 1616, mentions the feathers. Quote, "There is 1 red bird feather, 2 yellow feathers, 1 blue feather, and 2 white feathers. I saw these and said, 'Sell them!' But the Spanish would not agree." Interestingly, this letter reveals the valuable and prized nature of the feathers, not only for the Spanish, but also for the Japanese. So this is just the beginning of a project that I hope will uncover many more discoveries, because that's how it happens. Once you mention a project, things start coming out of the woodwork. So my new recent venture into the Mexico-Japan connection related to feathers really leaves me with more questions than answers about the understanding and awareness of Mexican colonial art in Japan and how it was adapted and reinterpreted there. I think that in a time in which the differences between people seems to be so heightened right now, looking for the affinities between cultures is just the remedy we all need. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Sophia. I look forward to what you discover and continue to uncover with this great research project. Right now, we are more or less back on track time-wise. We are going to adjourn for lunch now and meet back here by just before 2:30 for the final session, in which we have 3 speakers. So a little bit before 2:30. And we'll get underway then. Thank you all very much.